Emily pulled her jacket tighter around herself as she walked down the quiet streets of Maplewood, a small town in the Midwest. The evening was cold enough that her breath left pale clouds in the air, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the heavy guitar case in her hand. The case was scratched, the handle wrapped with layers of worn-out tape and the zipper pulled crookedly across the top. To someone else, it might have looked like junk. But to Emily, it was her lifeline, the one thing she could never let go of, no matter how hard life had been. The town wasn't unkind, but it wasn't forgiving either. Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and everyone formed opinions quickly. Emily, at 24, had already been labeled by most people the girl who didn't make it. She had dropped out of college when money ran out, worked shifts at the diner until late at night, and lived in a small apartment barely big enough for her and her dreams. People didn't see her as ambitious or talented. They just saw another young woman struggling to find her place. As she passed the police station, the bright fluorescent lights illuminated two officers leaning against the brick wall outside. They were sipping coffee from paper cups, sharing a laugh about something Emily couldn't hear, but as she approached, their attention shifted. One of them nudged the other with his elbow, nodding toward her guitar case. "Looks like we've got another one of those dreamers in town," the first officer said, loud enough for Emily to catch every word. His voice carried a mixture of amusement and mockery. The second officer chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, probably thinks she's the next big star. Doesn't look like much to me. Ordinary as they come." Their laughter followed, her as she walked past, her steps steady but her heart aching. She kept her gaze fixed on the sidewalk, refusing to let them see the sting in her eyes. It wasn't the first time someone had dismissed her, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, the words cut deep. Emily's entire life, people had underestimated her. When she was a little girl, she used to sing at church gatherings. Her grandmother would always tell her she had a gift, that her voice could move mountains. But as Emily grew older, encouragement turned into criticism. Teachers said music was a nice hobby, but not a real future. Friends told her she was wasting her time. And when her father left, and her mother worked double shifts just to keep food on the table, Emily learned quickly that dreams didn't pay bills. Now, standing under the harsh glow of the police station lights, she felt like a walking contradiction. To the world, she was just a tired girl in an old jacket, clutching a battered guitar case. Nothing special, just another face blending into the crowd. But inside, Emily carried something different. Every note she played, every lyric she wrote, came from a place deeper than appearances. Music was her way of telling the world who she really was, of expressing all the pain, hope, and longing that words alone could never capture. She knew she wasn't ordinary, not in the way people meant it. She just hadn't had the chance to prove it yet. As she turned the corner, away from the sound of the officer's laughter, her steps slowed. For a moment, she stopped under a flickering street lamp, setting her guitar case gently on the ground. She closed her eyes and drew in a shaky breath. The voices of doubt, those of the officers, of her teachers, of old friends who had given up on her, echoed in her head. But then another voice rose above them, her grandmother's, warm and unwavering. "Emily, don't ever let anyone tell you what you're worth. The world will laugh, the world will doubt, but the world doesn't. Know the fire inside you." The memory brought a faint smile to Emily's lips. She picked up the guitar case again, holding it tighter. She wasn't sure how, but she knew one day the people who mocked her would hear her music. And when they did, they would understand. She continued down the street, passing shuttered shops and quiet houses where lights glowed warmly behind curtains. Families were gathering for dinner, laughter spilling faintly from open windows. Emily felt the familiar pang of loneliness, but she also felt determination. She had learned to survive on very little, little money, little support, little belief from those around her, but she had never run out of songs, and that was why she kept going. By the time she reached her apartment, the night was fully settled in. She climbed the narrow stairs, listening to the creak of each step. Her home was small, a single room with a mattress on the floor, a desk pushed up against the window, and posters of her favorite musicians taped to the walls. The heater rattled noisily, but the air was still cold. She set the guitar case down. On the desk, carefully unzipping it, inside was the guitar her grandmother had saved for months to buy when Emily was 12. It wasn't fancy, just a second-hand acoustic, but Emily treated it like treasure. She ran her fingers along the strings, smiling softly. No matter how hard the world pushed her down, this guitar always lifted her back up. That night, as the officer's laughter replayed in her mind, Emily picked up the guitar and began to strum. At first, it was just soft notes, filling the silence of the tiny room. Then, slowly, words formed, spilling out like they always did when her heart was heavy. She sang about being underestimated, about carrying dreams no one else could see, about the fire burning quietly inside her. She sang for the girl everyone thought was ordinary, but who knew she was meant for something extraordinary. Her voice was quiet, but strong enough to carry hope through the thin apartment walls out into the night. Emily didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if the world would ever hear her music, or if the officers would ever see her differently. But as she played, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't giving up. No matter how many people laughed, she would keep walking, keep singing, keep proving to herself, most of all, that she was more than ordinary. The following Saturday dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made Maplewood feel like it belonged on a postcard. The annual community fair had arrived, and by mid-morning the town's central park was buzzing with life. Vendors set up booths with colorful banners, selling everything from homemade pies to hand-knit scarves. Children ran between the stalls, with painted faces and balloon animals in their hands. Couples strolled lazily, sipping lemonade from plastic cups. The smell of kettle corn drifted through the air, blending with the sound of laughter and chatter. In the center of the park stood a modest wooden stage. It wasn't fancy, just a raised platform with two large speakers on either side and a row of folding chairs for the audience. But it was the heart of the fair. Every year, the stage was open to anyone who wanted to share a talent. Local choirs, amateur magicians, teenagers reciting poems, even the occasional stand-up comic brave enough to risk the crowd's reaction. It was a tradition, a way for the community to celebrate itself. Emily arrived quietly, slipping into the crowd unnoticed. She wore the same plain jacket and jeans she always wore, her guitar case slung over her shoulder. She hadn't planned to perform. In fact, the very thought of standing on that stage made her stomach twist. But something inside her, maybe the memory of the officer's mocking laughter, maybe the quiet determination that had grown stronger each day, pulled her toward the stage. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as a group of children performed a clumsy but adorable dance routine. Parents cheered loudly, cameras flashing, while the kids grinned and waved. The applause was warm and encouraging, no matter how imperfect the performance was. Emily felt her heart ache. Part of her longed to be up there, to share her music, but fear held her back. What if they laughed? What if they thought she was just another ordinary girl pretending to be something she wasn't? As the children left the stage, the host, a cheerful man in his 50s with a booming voice, stepped up to the microphone. "All right, folks, let's give them another big round of applause," he called, clapping his hands. The crowd responded enthusiastically. "Next up, we have, well, let's see who's brave enough to come up and share their talent next." There was a moment of hesitation. People looked around, waiting for someone else to volunteer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Her hands tightened on the guitar case. She could hear her grandmother's voice in her mind again. "Don't ever let anyone tell you what you're worth." Before she could lose her nerve, Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward. At first, no one noticed. But as she approached the stage, people began to turn their heads. A few whispered quietly, surprised to see her. The officers who had laughed at her days before sat near the front, sipping sodas and chatting. When they saw Emily walking toward the microphone, one raised an eyebrow, smirking as if to say, "Really? Her?" Emily ignored it. Her legs trembled as she climbed the short steps to the stage. The host gave her an encouraging smile and whispered, "What will you be sharing with us today?" "Music," Emily replied softly, almost too quiet to hear. She set the guitar case on the ground and carefully lifted out the worn acoustic guitar. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them. Some looked curious, others skeptical. Emily adjusted the strap and stepped up to the microphone. For a moment she just stood there, frozen by the weight of 100 eyes on her. She could hear the rustle of the trees, the distant bark of a dog, the impatient shuffle of feet in the audience. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but then she remembered all the nights in her tiny apartment, singing to the cracked ceiling. She remembered the officers' mocking voices, and she remembered the promise she had made to herself, not to give up. Her fingers found the strings, and she strummed the first chord. The sound was soft but steady, ringing through the speakers and catching the crowd's attention. Conversations died down. Children who had been running at the edge of the park stopped and turned. Emily began to sing. Her voice was clear, fragile at first, but growing stronger with each line. The song was one she had written herself, a story wrapped in melody. It spoke of long nights working in silence, of being invisible in a world that only valued the loudest voices. It spoke of dreams carried in secret, of hope that refused to die no matter how many times it was dismissed. At first, the crowd listened politely, the way people do when they don't expect much. A few leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed. One of the officers chuckled under his breath. But as the song unfolded, something shifted. Emily's voice carried a raw honesty, a depth of emotion that pierced through the noise of daily life. Her words painted vivid pictures of resilience, of holding on when everything seemed lost. By the second verse, the murmurs had quieted completely. Parents leaned forward. Children sat cross-legged on the grass, eyes wide. People who had been walking past the park stopped at the edges, drawn in by the music. Even the vendors paused in their work, listening. Emily closed her eyes as she sang, losing herself in the story. She wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She wasn't thinking about the officers or the risk of being laughed at. She was simply pouring out everything inside her, every hurt, every hope, every ounce of strength she had carried silently for years. Her voice soared on the chorus, strong and unbroken, echoing across the park. And in that moment, the girl, who had been invisible, became impossible to ignore. When she reached the bridge of the song, her voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't stop. Tears welled in her eyes, though she kept singing. The vulnerability in her performance made it all the more powerful. People in the crowd began to shift in their seats, visibly moved. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A teenage boy lowered his phone, too captivated to record, and the officers, those who had once mocked her, sat frozen. Their smirks were gone, replaced by something else entirely, regret, maybe even awe. The final chorus rang out like a declaration, bold and fearless. Emily strummed the last chord, letting it linger in the air. For a long moment, there was silence. The entire park seemed to hold its breath, caught in the spell of her song. Then, all at once, the applause erupted. It wasn't polite clapping, it was thunderous, heartfelt, overwhelming. People stood to their feet, cheering and whistling. Some shouted her name. Children clapped wildly, their faces lit with excitement. Parents exchanged looks of surprise, as if asking each other, where did this come from? Emily opened her eyes, stunned by the reaction. For a moment she stood there in disbelief, her guitar still in her hands. She had imagined this scene 1,000 times in her head, but living it was something else entirely. She looked out into the sea of faces and saw tears, smiles, admiration. And then she saw the officers. They were clapping too, louder than most, their expressions humbled and sincere. Their earlier laughter seemed like a distant memory, erased by the undeniable truth of what they had just heard. Emily gave a small, trembling smile and whispered into the microphone, "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but the crowd roared back in response. As she left the stage, people reached out to pat her shoulder, to shake her hand, to tell her how much her song had touched them. For the first time in her life, Emily felt truly seen, not as an ordinary girl, not as someone struggling to get by, but as someone who had something extraordinary to share. Walking back through the park, guitar case in hand, she felt lighter than she ever had. The officers' laughter no longer echoed in her mind. Instead, the sound of applause filled her memory, wrapping around her like warmth on a cold night. She had faced her fear, she had shared her truth, and the world had listened. The sun dipped low behind the trees as the fair wound down, painting the park in hues of orange and gold. The smell of grilled food still lingered in the air, but the energy had shifted. People weren't just chatting about games or rides anymore, they were talking about Emily. Strangers who had never noticed her before gathered in small clusters, replaying the memory of her song. Some spoke about the rawness of her voice, others about the way her lyrics felt like they were written just for them. It wasn't just a performance, it was something more. It was a moment people knew they wouldn't forget. Emily stood at the edge of the park, her guitar safely back in its worn case, her heart still racing. She hadn't expected this. When she stepped onto that stage, she had braced herself for ridicule or indifference. She had prepared for the possibility that her voice would disappear into the noise of the day, forgotten before the next act began. Instead, she had felt the entire town pause, listen, and be moved. As she started to leave, a woman approached her. She looked to be in her 40s, her eyes still glistening. "That song," she said softly, placing a hand over her heart. "It was like you were telling my story. Thank you for sharing it." Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. All she could manage was a quiet, "Thank you." Then came more people. Parents, teenagers, even older couples. They stopped her to say how beautiful her voice was, how brave she had been to stand up. How her words had touched something deep inside them. Some even asked if she had written more songs, if she planned to perform again. Emily's cheeks burned with a mixture of pride and disbelief. For so long, she had sung alone in her small apartment, wondering if her music meant anything to anyone. And now, here were dozens of voices telling her it did. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the 2 police officers making their way toward her. Her chest tightened. She remembered their laughter, the sting of their words earlier that week. She considered slipping into the crowd to avoid them, but it was too late. They stopped just a few feet away, looking uncharacteristically serious. The taller of the 2 cleared his throat. "Emily, right?" She nodded, her grip tightening. On the handle of her guitar case, he shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. "Listen, about the other night, when we made those comments." He paused, glancing at his partner before continuing. "We were wrong. Completely wrong. We judged you without knowing anything about you, and after hearing you tonight, well..." He gave a small, awkward smile. "You proved us wrong, big time." The second officer added, "You've got real talent, I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen the park so quiet. You had everyone hanging on every word." Emily studied their faces. The mockery she remembered was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like humility. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to hold on to the hurt, to remind them how cruel their laughter had felt. But another part of her recognized the power in this moment, not just for them, but for her. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice calm but steady. "I just wanted people to hear me for who I really am." The officers nodded, their expressions softening. "They did," the taller one said simply, "and so did we." They gave her a respectful nod before stepping back into the crowd, leaving Emily standing with a strange sense of peace. For the first time, she didn't feel weighed down by their earlier judgment. Instead, she felt lighter, as though she had proven not just to them, but to herself, that she was more than their assumptions. As the sky darkened, the fair began to close. Families packed up their picnic blankets, vendors dismantled their booths, and the stage crew started winding cords and carrying equipment. Emily walked slowly toward the exit of the park, the sound of her footsteps blending with the fading chatter of the crowd. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a message from a number she didn't recognize. "Hi, Emily. I was at the fair tonight. I help organize events at the community center. Would you consider performing there next month?" Emily stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. An invitation, a real chance to share her music again, this time in front of an even larger audience. She couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. When she reached her apartment that night, she set the guitar gently on her desk and sat down on the edge of her bed. The room was still the same, small, cluttered, lit by the flicker of a single lamp, but everything felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with the memory of applause, of faces turned toward her in awe, of voices telling her that her music mattered. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing as she let the memory wash over her. For years, she had carried the weight of doubt, other people's and her own. Tonight, that weight had lifted, replaced by something new. Belief. Not just belief from others, but belief in herself. Emily knew this was only the beginning. There would still be challenges, still nights of uncertainty, still people who doubted her, but she had tasted something powerful. The moment when her voice connected with others, when her story became theirs, when the ordinary melted away to reveal the extraordinary. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "I'm not invisible anymore." Outside, the town of Maplewood settled into its quiet evening routine. Lights glowed softly in windows, the streets emptied, and the park grew still again. But something had changed. A girl who had once been dismissed as ordinary had stepped onto a stage and shown everyone, including herself, that she was anything but. And though the fair would come and go each year, people in Maplewood would remember this night. They would remember the girl with the worn guitar and the trembling hands who sang her truth so boldly that it silenced a crowd. They would remember how they felt when her song echoed in their hearts. Emily lay down that night, with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the chance she took, for the courage she found, for the lesson she had learned. The world might still try to laugh, still try to label her, still try to put her in a box. But she knew now that her voice could break through all of it, and she promised herself she would never, ever let it go silent again.